I recorded most of this in the middle of the night when I was very tired, and I'll try to improve the sound quality for the future. But for now, let's enjoy some torture. Does anybody else think that that intro soundtrack sounds eerily similar to the TV show Fringe intro soundtrack? Or is that just me?
Oh, hi, babes. Fun fact, I'm white. I know. Congrats, Lacey. You've figured out your race.
Actually, Lacey, you're black. You're very black. I'm sorry to have to correct you on that.
But this is actually pretty significant. For most of my life, I was blissfully unaware of the fact that I'm white. My race never affected me. A huge benefit I didn't even know that I had.
With the advent of social justice warrior narratives and identity politics, I would have thought it would be a disadvantage, but I think perhaps your female status overrides that.
Growing up, I knew racism is bad, but I didn't really understand what racism is. I thought racism was slurs, discrimination, hating someone based on their skin color.
Racism is the prejudice of someone based on the irrelevant characteristic of their race. It is typically used to describe malevolent prejudice against one of black skin color by one of white skin color. But I can understand where your confusion lies, because there has been so much misinformation about this subject perpetrated by the sorts of extreme elements of social justice warrior identity politics.
About 50 years ago, direct, in-your-face, this overt racism became illegal and less socially acceptable.
It has only been made illegal under hate speech laws to protect those of minority status, but the same tactics are still used in reverse on the evil rich white boogeyman stereotype,
which had two side effects on white America.
I love this attempt to frame America as some divided, segregated nation where you have white America and black America, as if there is some massive racial divide that still exists. There may be some racist elements here and there. I also believe there is a tribalistic, instinctive, subconscious process at work in people that tends to cause black and whites to cluster together and form more closely knit groups. But in the classical sense of malevolent racism towards blacks, it's very fringe and rare. I think the most pervasive example of racial prejudice these days is the social justice warriors and their extreme racial narratives, which seem to be unable to look beyond racial lines. They only seem to be able to think in terms of race and racism. But let's find out what the two effects this had on white America, quote unquote.
First, it allowed us to believe that racism is over. Yeah, I'm okay. I love that guy.
Racism is really over when you become colorblind. The point is that it's irrelevant. That's the whole point. Race is irrelevant. It doesn't tell you the character of the person. It doesn't tell you if they're allowed to own property. It doesn't tell you if they are deserving of a couple of lashes with the whip just because they have that skin color. With no evidence, with no case, to assume that racism still exists and in such a way that it fits your narrative of malevolent racism against blacks perpetrated by whites, is to presume the guilt of every white person in their interactions with black people. It is absurd, and you cannot do that. It undermines the very foundation of the legal system and justice. And how can you assume somebody's motives? It's very difficult to prove someone's motives, especially in the cases with Ferguson, and this is what really irritated me. In all of the reporting, it was reported as some sort of racist scandal. And even if whether it was or wasn't is irrelevant, because the standards by which it should be measured, in which the case should be measured, are race neutral. Whether this was appropriate police behavior or inappropriate police behavior. Now, I understand that there is a case to be made for police being the first check in the legal system. I mean, they can choose to let you off a speeding ticket or whatever at their discretion. Now, you can say this is right or wrong, but this is the current way the system is set up. So, if your police officers are racist, this system could be definitely distorted in such a way against African Americans. But I found the case to be, whenever it was reported, the reporters were sure to use the adjectives white police officer kills black teen, specifically to describe and frame the incident as a racial event. And this I found to be propaganda, because they had not, in my mind at least, proved it to be racist. Now, you can debate it in various different ways, but I definitely got the impression that it was that they were attempting to frame this event as a racist, a malevolently racist event against blacks, regardless of the whole picture.
Secondly, it enabled white folks to frame the ongoing struggles of the black community as a character flaw.
Now, I worked in a restaurant in a lower class town a little bit away from where I live. And one of the things I noticed was that there were cultural expectations and ideas that the people who work there and the people who lived in the area had, that I noticed would keep them in poverty. Specifically, one of the ones that I noticed was regarding children. There were a lot of young women working at the establishment, and other people women who came in, who I noticed who had this idea that who didn't think that it was wrong or had been a bad idea to have kids at this young age in this sort of financial situation. And I noticed that these people just were like, well, you're never really ready to have kids, and so we'll just have kids, the moment I can get myself pregnant. And it was just this idea that from these women, and the men were going along with it and agreeing with it. And I just thought, if I can mathematically show you it's a bad idea, that you're already in the financial strain yourself and you want to drag a kid through this, I mean, even if you don't care about yourself, at least consider that the kid is going to have a pretty low-class, poor life, if, relatively speaking, if you're going to drag them through that. And so I thought there are definitely conditions where culturally, in an environment, that trailer trash breeds trailer trash. It really does. And so it is this sort of parasitic ideas that they then collect government welfare and entitlements because their kids are going to need it. They need to pay for their kids, and tend to have very dysfunctional relationships too. And so when people refer to blacks as being perhaps maybe in this way that you're referring to, it's not that they're saying that that they are this way because their skin color is black. It is acknowledging that the predominant number of blacks are in poverty and live in this culture. It's not the skin color which makes the culture. It's the culture which encompasses most of the blacks. This is what they are acknowledging.
So after Ferguson, a family member said to me, "Look, Lacey, black people have a lot of problems because they have a bad culture, bad values. They're violent, they're lazy, broken families. Look at them out there riding like animals. That's not racism, that's just the facts." Whoa there, tell me how you really feel. Now, people usually aren't so blunt about it, but
Well, maybe they should be.
if you look closely, you're going to see these sentiments about black America echoed everywhere.
So I taught school for 20 years. A lot of people of color who didn't want to work as hard, they wanted it given to them.
They don't like make a living for themselves. They just drop out of high school. I'm gonna have kids. I'm gonna get a welfare check.
I'm gonna get my GED.
I'll get my GED. I'm gonna go work at McDonald's.
Young black men often reject education and gravitate towards the street culture, drugs, hustling, gangs. Nobody forces them to do that. Again, it is a personal decision.
The message, to be black, is to be inferior.
No, that is not what's being said. What's being said is that blacks tend to live in a culture with ideas that breed this behavior and reproduce this culture. It is not necessarily terribly helpful advice being dispensed in these channels, but they are not wrong. And Lacey, if you cannot correctly identify the problem, you can never solve it. What you are doing will keep these people in poverty.
But that's not the facts, that's just racism. Racism isn't just burning crosses and white hoods. Racism is a seeping system of forces that effectively keep people of color in a permanent second-class status. It's the foundational fabric of our society, woven with values and attitudes, stereotypes, policies, economics, laws.
And so begins the insanity. This is to say that anything that disadvantages African Americans, minorities, etc., is designed to is doing so because it is by design. It is just so absurd. What she's doing is looking at the results and thinking this is the intention. It's also very naive of her to think that, for instance, because, and I know she didn't give this specific example, but it's one I've heard before, because capitalism isn't sending money their way, that capitalism is evil. It's just this complete inability to look beyond racial lines and actually think about what these people are doing versus what their skin color is. And not realizing that's what they're doing that's keeping them in poverty. This is to say that any employment troubles I have had or any rejections or interactions with police officers that went poorly for me were out of racism, that people were being racist towards me, malevolently prejudiced against whites. And this is just not the case. The result of these actions, to what race they or sex they particularly affect, cannot be used as a metric to determine whether or not they are racist by nature.
Jim Crow was replaced with a host of shiny new laws that were just as racist, but looked better on the surface.
Would it make you feel better if we introduced laws that specifically had white people give their money to black people? Would that be done better? Because I thought that would be racist.
This has made it harder than ever for white America to see the truth. The odds are ever in our favor, and they always have been.
So that's why slavery has historically just been of the lower classes. It's not necessarily been a black on white or racially divided institution.
Let's take a stroll down memory lane.
How old are you?
Stop one. Wealth. Between 1934 and 1962, the government backed $120 billion of home loans. But they refused to give out home loans to black folks, or even if black folks lived nearby. This went on for decades. This practice, called redlining, essentially, 1, forced black Americans into poor urban centers, the beginnings of the ghetto. 2, segregated America to this day. 3, made it impossible to invest in the future of black neighborhoods. And 4, made it impossible for black Americans to start inheriting property and wealth the same way that white Americans were.
While I will concede that if you're describing this correctly in that the government specifically used race as a means to determine who got the money, then yes, that is racism and racial discrimination. However, I also want to point out that the free market would have taken care of that pretty quickly, in that the government intervention in this manner is what created the housing bubble, and at least in part, and government intervention in the free market creates the moral hazards and other such things which lead to these bubbles and other communistic imbalances. Eventually, when debt saturation was reached, the housing bubble burst and all these properties were devalued substantially, and all that wealth disappeared.
Stop 2, education. Property taxes fund schools, which means that families that live in nice houses, maybe ones they got with the help of the government, get a better education. Better education means more opportunities, more resources, more connections, more jobs, more money, money, money.
So we're assuming the same tax rate, and this false notion that education is the way to a successful financial status. The education bubble and boom that we are experiencing is a result of the poor economy, not a solution for it. It is a consequence of it. That now we have increased competition on the labor side. If you assume that more money means a better education, and if you assume that more education means more money, then yes. But this hasn't necessarily proven to be true, especially since the education costs in the United States keep on rising, perhaps due to government intervention in student loans, creating an oversupply of demand for education, and backing the student loans so everybody can afford them no matter what cost they are, so the education institutions can jack them up. And then that there is no jobs anyway, so people keep getting more and more debt in student loans so that they can keep going back to school in the progressive credentialism because the economy is not growing. But anyway, I digress. This is very misleading economically. This isn't economically accurate, but I know that's not what we're talking about. This is not even to mention the worthless degrees most people get. But this is very much a build off of the last point she made, so there's not too much to add.
Stop 3, jobs. The lack of educational opportunities meant that many black folks were relegated to low-wage manual labor. Today, when looking at the same exact resume, employers are 50% more likely to call back a resume labeled with a white-sounding name.
It's also still not economically applicable, because it also could mean that these people now don't have student debt. The trades also have been doing quite well, especially since the education industry has taught many kids that they should be pursuing glamorous jobs when going off to college to get some fancy degree that's not going to get them a job, when they could go off to trade school for much cheaper, learn to weld, and make a lot of money doing that job, and yet this isn't pushed. And while I will admit the name discrimination on resumes is cause for concern and wrong, I'd suspect it's due to the black culture being detrimental to work ethic and performance, as the people tend not to want to work and champion the gangster lifestyle and this is likely what is driving this behavior. I see this as treating the symptoms rather than the problem.
Stop 4. Mass incarceration. Shortly after the civil rights movement, prisons became privatized for-profit businesses. Fill those cells, make those dollars, and they did. The prison population shot up from 200,000 to 2.4 million. More than any country in the world. And who filled those cells? People of color.
More African American adults are under correctional control today than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began.
Black men are now imprisoned at 6 times the rate of white men. So did black men just become 6 times more dangerous? Or of course not. What changed was the laws and sentencing. Sweeping laws were written that specifically targeted black communities. For instance, the sentence for possession of crack was 100 times harsher than the sentence for cocaine.
While for-profit prisons and the incarceration rate in the United States is a massive call for concern, I hardly see it as a racial issue. You haven't said anything that tells me that it is in any way specifically trying to target blacks. I'd rather think the drug mandatory minimums that you were referring to are coincidental, but I could be wrong. It's not conclusive.
Stop 5, racial profiling. It wasn't just harsher sentencing. Communities of color are also policed more harshly.
One of the few memories I have of my dad as a kid is seeing him yelled at and questioned by police on the street. And when they didn't like the answers he was giving them to their questions, they proceeded to aggressively question me. And I was just 8 years old.
Policies like Show Me Your Papers and Stop and Frisk target people of color under the law. Totally legal. So shocker, they're much more likely to get arrested for doing the same things that white people do, but twice as likely to get pulled over. Take the late Walter Scott, who was pulled over for having a broken taillight, only to be shot 5 times in the back by a cop. Stop 6.
I agree with you. I agree. Racially profiling people is prejudice, and it's racist, and it's wrong. And this can also speak to police brutality and conduct issues that go on throughout the United States for everybody.
Police brutality. Police brutality is front and center of the race conversation right now. Twice a week in the US, white officers kill black suspects, most of whom are unarmed. And the consequences are minimal, if any. Might even get paid a bunch of money for it. The police themselves admit to widespread usage of excessive force and racial bias. So what does America do? Oh, just give them military supplies, of course.
Okay, Lacey, you were on to a very serious problem of police brutality and abuse of power that exists in the United States. And don't conflate racism with the militarization of the police. It might predominantly affect blacks because of the racist issues with the police, but that's a separate issue that affects everybody.
Tanks, protective gear, firepower used in war, all the while wagging a finger at protesters that dare to be outraged by it. Sadly, this is all just the tip of the racism iceberg.
It might be just the tip of a totalitarian, authoritarian government, but racism, that's a different issue.
We really need to ask ourselves, what's really causing the problems that we're observing in America? What advantages has white America been given, often without even realizing it?
Lacey, please tell me. I'd love to know, because I really want some magical privilege that I can use for my own benefit. Come on, let me have it. Please inform me.
The first step in combating racism, and often the hardest step, is acknowledging it, acknowledging that the system is unfair. Racism is a powerful institution built by 400 years of slavery, 100 years of outright discrimination, 50 plus more years of covert discrimination. A legacy that long in the making doesn't just disappear overnight. America got a lot of work to do.
You don't solve racism by being racist.